people sexily drink tea because it's just not that talented. You always need some foamy milk, some beautiful tea, some lipstick stain, because you're not fancy enough to have fancy lipstick that doesn't stain. I am here with no notes at all to talk about the newly Pulitzer Prize-winning novel Demon Copperhead. I was about 20% into it when it won, and I scurriedly finished. I was 20% in for a while because I was having trouble getting in. I started the novel and I immediately had an inkling that I wasn't going to love it. And parts of it did really bring me over, and a lot of parts didn't. And I want to discuss those things with you. This has no notes at all, so I'm not going to try to be super organized or analytical or intellectual. I'm just going to talk about some of my thoughts. So if you're not familiar with Demon Copperhead, it is a book by Barbara Kinslover. She is an acclaimed American author. She started as a science researcher and stuff, and then she started writing in the 1980s and has published many novels in the last little while. Her most notable book as of yet is the Poisonwood novel that looks at a missionary family in Africa and I believe the effects of colonialism there. This is a book that she was shortlisted for the Pulitzer Prize in 1999. And she also received some acclaim for the novel Lacuna, which won the Women's Prize in 2010, maybe 2009. I'm not quite sure, and I actually have no idea what that book is about, to be honest. However, I am interested to talk about Demon Copperhead. It owes its name to David Copperfield, which was a book that was published in 1851 and 1852, I believe. And it was serialized and tells the eventful story of a young orphan whose father dies before he was born and his mother does not live that long into his life. And it is one of Charles Dickens' most autobiographical works because it looks at his time as a child laborer in the factories in London. After I had finished this novel and I wanted to go back and remember some of my David Copperfield thoughts, I did watch the vlog that I had made during October of last year. And one of the things that I had pointed out at the time was how young he was. He was age 10. He had such a hard time differentiating between his ability to take care of himself and what his immediate needs was. So he would, in the morning be so hungry that he would buy himself a scone or something from a bakery, and then he would starve. And the fact that that is such a wonderful image of the responsibility that should not have been put on him. Demon Copperhead is an interesting story. It's a retelling set in the Appalachian Mountains in the United States. And I would say that I'm not the most educated person to talk about the topic. I'm Canadian, and I've always had this murky understanding of what the Appalachians were. I have done a little more research to know about this topic, but I still feel like I had no idea what this area was. I knew some of the stereotypes about rednecks and other things, but I did not know that that was specific to a specific area of town. I live in Canada where there is a lot of redneck people and such, but it is just a term to use for people who live rurally and not in any particular area. But the Appalachian Mountains and Appalachian people have received a lot of really negative portrayals over the years of being stupid and being intellectually inferior, and their poverty being driven upon them as their own reason. And as the 1980s and 1990s and 2000s dealt with increased levels of drug use in the area, they became blamed for that and had this stereotype that they brought this upon themselves. And this is something that is looked at in this novel, and I want to say successfully looked at in this way, but I don't know, because I think that it definitely looks at the environment of people who use drugs and the fact that they have humanity and stuff like that. But I also don't know if the representation ever goes to the extent that is humanizing to the degree that would change someone's mind. And maybe someone else would have a different opinion about this. As someone who has a background in counseling and has worked with people with drug addictions and stuff like that, I would have loved it to go further, I think. And that could be my own bias and stuff like that. When I was thinking about my thoughts on how a lot of this representation may be uncomfortable, I thought about the fact that this is something that is in Black representation discourse about the idea that Black people deserve to be represented outside of the model citizen, and the right to be represented as messy and not tragic is something that is important, because you need to be able to have a myriad thing. If you have such a idea that, there's the right and there's the bad, and you only get compassion if you're a straight A student and do all of these things, I do think that that's a really fair criticism, that we need a variety of representation. And maybe the representation that is positive in this era is to show that a lot of these characters made really dumb decisions, and yet that does not take away their humanity. And yet I do think that in some ways, a lot of the characters I would have loved more compassion for, especially the female characters, which is an interesting thing as it's currently shortlisted for the Women's Prize and many people's pick to win the Women's Prize. And I don't know, I don't think we ever get really fully fleshed female characters in this novel, which is interesting because that is one of my main complaints of the original novel. It's something that sat against me in a way that I didn't like, especially the treatment of what is Dora in that novel and Dory in this novel. I think that she herself is the emblem of drug use in this novel, and we see the ways in which she is this doll, and you see the symmetry in the Dickens novel so well, and there is some minor spoilers in it, but the way in which she is kind of seen as this dream girl and then is discarded and seen as this inconvenience. And it is really as she seeps more and more and more into drug use. And the way that it depicted made me as uncomfortable as it did in Charles Dickens, which is interesting to have a 200-year gap almost in there. And to me to still feel so deeply uncomfortable. I use the phrase that the male gaze is thick, and I think that that is true. It's kind of disgusting metaphor, but you really do feel like it's oozing kind of this perverted sensuality in many ways. You know, we have Demon really looking at a lot of the female characters in the ways in which they can be sexualized, and it also kind of relates this almost to a Freudian level of like how he is missing his mother and is angry and yet wanting of his mother still, and he kind of sexualizes some of the women in that, and that what he really wants is a mother. And all of that is stuff that doesn't really do much for me. Most of Freud's work has been discarded and discounted because of this. We don't really believe in those things scientifically, and I think that it would have been more interesting to look at his anxious attachment or something like that that would have been more representative of this. I did like the way in which Demon uses drugs, which is a weird way to say it, but this is something that he does not necessarily choose, but first of all gets kind of peer pressured into, and then because of an accident he starts using oxy. And then there's an embarrassment in quitting because of the side effects, because of the terrible withdrawals, and how much you can self-meditate to just keep yourself from crapping yourself, literally, and other things. And the ways in which he's constantly looking for approval, both familiarly and also socially, is something that I think is really evident and a really interesting level to explore why he struggles with some of the things that he does and the ways in which he can't say it. Like the foster care system is something that is very evident because of the ways in which he is not believed and the ways in which just children are discarded. And even if the people are aware of the fact that, you know, it's a messed up situation, they also know that they can't really do anything about it. And yeah, I thought that those critiques were very evident. One of the things that I think failed for me is that a lot of the relationships that were evident in David Copperfield, and I do think that I'm going to be comparing these, and some of you people probably don't want to hear that, but the thing that I find interesting is that I think more than anything, Demon Copperhead made me like David Copperfield better, which is interesting. I've always said that the book is middling because I think that I struggled with David as a main character. I didn't feel connected to him, and I thought that it dragged and, you know, had some repeat things because it's serialized. It goes on for a really, really long time. Demon Copperhead is quite a long book, and David Copperfield is really long. One is like 600 pages and one is 900 pages. So they're very long novels. And the thing that I felt interested is that I do think that Demon is a slightly more fleshed character than David in some ways, but I don't think that there's another character that's as fleshed out as they are in the original, which is really shocking to me because I think that modern literature does a better job at portraying characters with more fully fleshed things. And it's also something that I had as a recommendation, that these characters feel like they live outside of the narrative. And I don't know if I feel like that. Like I do think that like some characters like June and stuff like that, you can like feel their life beyond that. But I also think on who June was based on in the original novel, and I like her character better. I think of, you know, Miss Barkis and the character that I liked better. I think of Betsy Trotwood and how much I love Betsy. And even like Tommy and a lot of the other characters. Like I didn't realize how much I liked the original characters until I saw the ways they were represented and their relationships with David being less so, and also like not as impactful. Even Uriah Heep. Like how did I miss Uriah Heep in here? But I did. Like, you know, Uriah Heep is a character here, but Uriah Heep is one of the most miserable, slimy characters in history. Like, you feel like it's oozing on you, and that's not a pleasant thing. Like, just imagine a snail and that, and like him just, you feel like he's coming from the page, and like, yeah, it's unpleasant in every way. And that character does exist, but I think that it's played off in a way that just doesn't seem as impactful. And again, I know where it's going, so maybe that's why. But I feel like his level of menace and like lingering, and even his mother, like the way that his mother in the few scenes that she's in just like clenches you up. And then I think the characters in the McCobbs, they are so much more compassionate in the original, because Charles Dickens actually based them on his parents, because his parents were in and out of debtor's prison and like brought all their children, and like, you know, his mother was like, I will always stand by this man who is making really irresponsible decisions, and like Charles Dickens obviously had the impact of that and trying to like support his parents and like running his parents out of prison because of debts and stuff over and over again. So I think that the way that he protects them is much kinder and more compassionate, even though like they are absurd and stuff like that and obviously have some maliciousness in them. They are like outright kind of malicious in some ways, like not completely, like they're not villains, but they're also, they don't have the strike of good or of like at least wanting rightness. And almost all of these characters do something that is very noble near the end of the novel, and we have a very kind of conclusive thought toward all of the side characters. Like the way in which all of the side characters come together and end is really, really beautiful in David Copperfield, and we don't really get that. Like, none of their characters are really wrapped up with the same finality and stuff, and a lot of the relationships do have less impact for me. I do really like the addition of Maggot and the way in which his life and story is done. I think that that is really interesting story, and yet his story does peter out as it gets older because Demon and his other relationships have less effect on his thing, and he's not a character from the original that I can tell from. But I think the ways in which like Ham and Steerforth, who is Fast Forward, and a lot of these other characters exist, almost feel like they exist in their plots. I think that they feel like they played out more because they existed in the narrative of David Copperfield more than they existed in the narrative. And someone who's never read the book may tell me a different thought on this. But yeah, like I didn't feel the catharsis that I felt in that way. Like I felt really emotional about Emily and Steerforth and all of these characters in ways that I really didn't in here. And maybe that's because I had a grander idea and I was like less attached to them here. I think that Fast Forward story was interesting in some ways and stuff like that, but I just wasn't satisfied in the same way that I was in the others. I think that I liked him better here, but I also didn't like his ending in the same way. Anyways, it's a very interesting thing. I'm trying not to like make huge spoilers here. I think that Angus/Agnes is an interesting story. I think that she is outlined in both of them. I have interesting thoughts on the comparisons between Agnes and Dora in the main novel and how it is in the retelling and stuff. And yeah, I'm not really concluded there. I don't think that Agnes has as big of a character plot here as she does in some of the others. Also the ants. The ants I loved. I like part of my whole thing was talking about how much I loved Dora's ants, who are just dicks here. And I'm just like, oh, but they're so great in the main novel. Anyways, I do think there's a more nihilistic lens in this one. During the middle and end part of this novel, Demon is really, really struggling with drug addiction when David Copperfield is a quite, you know, successful novelist. So the ways in which their lives are comparison is quite different. And it's very interesting to see their comparisons. And I think that one makes the book a much more nihilistic take than others. I think that it does say something about recovery and stuff. It actually made me think about From the Ashes by Jessie Thistle, who writes a memoir about being Indigenous, the ways in which like the foster care system really failed him and the ways in which like addiction was passed on and his journey of recovering and becoming someone who, you know, learned to love literature and like how much it felt and how hard it was to hope. Like I feel like From the Ashes is actually a better adaptation of David Copperfield and some of the message and some of that was going through like drug addiction and homelessness. And he really talks about like how much systems and stuff like that affect the ways in which we feel like we can succeed, and how much actually believing people and pushing people forward and trusting them allows people to succeed well, and how often the barriers are social and not in your brain or actually in your capacity at all. And I really appreciated that. I think that that is something that I enjoyed in that, where there's a comment about how the kids of upstate are not more intelligent than us, they just have better resources, and about like the ways in which, you know, people are cycling and trying to, you know, rip off poor people and then accuse them and stuff like that. I do think that we have some conversation about the systematic issues going on, and Barbara Kinsliver is someone who lives in the Appalachian area, and it is a hometown, you know, story of her. She is not talking from an outside way, she is talking from her own point of view. I will say that one of my highlights is Mr. Armstrong and Miss Annie. They were definitely an improvement. I loved Mr. Armstrong. I feel like I have a crush on that man. So great. Miss Annie, also really great. Like, I feel like some of those plots could have been like dived in more. I feel like a similar thing to David Copperfield, where like a lot of stuff was summarized over when I really wanted to like dive in and kind of sit in those moments. But because it's really told from this like narrative voice that's from the future and stuff, we really do have that kind of speedy jump through. Like, you know, the beginning of David Copperfield reads, "I was born," or whatever like this, "and whether I am the hero of my story is yet to be seen." And I just like that tongue-in-cheek stuff. I am not a fan of overarching first-person narratives. That's not what I like. I really like the really intensely like painful, no named protagonist first person, like Rebecca or Lester or like something like that, where it's like it's very like intense. And Delicacy is another example. Like, if the character doesn't have a name, cool, I'm good at that. Or I need like this massive ensemble cast with all of these like worthing characters. Like, right after this I started The Swimmers, and I was like, yep, it's talking about all of these various people doing all of these things, and I'm like, that is the fresh breath of air that I need. Like, close personal first person narratives are not mine, because I just felt like so lost in the narrative. Like, I wanted it to zoom in and talk about details, and I know that's like a completely subjective criticism. It has no actual backing in worth or merit or anything like that. It's just my own style, and it's what I really like and what I really struggled with it, because I wanted a more complex, nuanced, deeper, wider story than it was. And yeah, I don't think Demon Copperhead is a bad book. I just don't think that it was a book for me. And I do think that because of the narrative voice, it does use a lot of ableistic terms and stuff like that that also really didn't like me. Like, the ways in which there is sexism and there is ableism and there is just not great language in the book really doesn't make me want to love the book more. It just kind of makes me go, ugh. You know what I mean? And yeah, I think that this is a fine book. I understand why it won the Pulitzer Prize. I think that it has things to say about America. I'm not American, you know, this isn't my story to comment on. And yeah, on the other hand, I think I do want to talk about Trust a little more, because Trust is a book I absolutely love, and it is the one that tied this book. And I'm really thankful for this, because even though it's not a book that worked for everyone, it did work for me. I felt seen, I felt represented, I felt the intense ways in which women are treated and the pervasive sexual harassment and stuff that happens there. And I felt represented in the ways in which the male gaze was evident there, but it was also being pushed back, and the blankness of that. I appreciated the ways in which it also let drug use be every day. Like, it didn't make the dramatics of these things really huge. It just allowed people to live in their trauma and it not be a very special episode or anything like that. Like, it didn't not look at the cost. Like, you see the effects of these, but you also see that it's part of everyday's life, and it's not as dramatic, but it's really impactful. And I don't know, I think that this is a book that I could warm on in some time. Just like, you know, it's a book that made me love David Copperfield more than I thought I could. And yeah, maybe I'll revisit one day. I'm looking forward to reading more of Barbara Kinsliver's novels. Let me know if you're happy this won the Pulitzer Prize. Let me know if you are rooting for this for the Women's Prize. If this is nonsense, you know, these are old news. I'd still love to hear from you. I really love comments and discussions. It's what makes me really happy to be a booktuber more than anything. And yeah, I'll see you next time, guys.